On the morning of April 29, 1936, General-Lieutenant Walther Wever stood before a drafting table in the Reich Air Ministry on Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin, examining blueprints whose realization would determine whether Germany could wage the war that its leadership was already contemplating. The room smelled of cigarette smoke, drafting ink, and the particular mustiness of a building whose renovations had not kept pace with the expanding bureaucracy it housed. Wever was 49 years old, a former infantry officer from Posen who had served on the Western Front, transferred to aviation in the war's final years, and risen through the interwar Reichswehr to become the first chief of staff of the newly established Luftwaffe. His face was serious, his bearing reflecting the Prussian traditions that his career embodied, his attention fixed on drawings that depicted an aircraft Germany did not yet possess, but that his strategic vision insisted Germany must build. The blueprints before him outlined the Dornier Do-19 and the Junkers UA-89, four-engine heavy bombers whose specifications Wever had championed against resistance from colleagues who considered such aircraft unnecessary extravagance. The designs were massive by contemporary German standards, their wingspans exceeding 35 meters, their projected ranges approaching 2,000 kilometers with meaningful bomb loads. Wever called them Ural-Bomber, a designation that revealed their strategic purpose with geographic precision. These aircraft would be capable of reaching Soviet industrial centers beyond the Ural Mountains, of striking at the factories and refineries whose destruction would cripple any enemy's capacity to wage modern war. They represented not merely a weapons system, but a conception of air power whose implications extended far beyond the tactical support that most Luftwaffe officers considered aviation's primary purpose. The strategic vision that these blueprints embodied had occupied Wever's thinking since his appointment as Chief of Staff in 1933. He had studied the theorists who argued that air power had transformed warfare fundamentally. Giulio Douhet in Italy, Billy Mitchell in America, Hugh Trenchard in Britain, and had concluded that their essential insight was correct, even if their specific predictions required modification. Wars in the industrial age would be won or lost through the destruction of enemy production capacity, the elimination of the factories and transportation networks and energy systems that sustained modern military forces. The nation that could strike at these assets while protecting its own would possess advantages that no amount of tactical excellence could overcome. Germany, if it intended to wage war successfully against the industrial powers that surrounded it, required the means to reach and destroy their productive foundations. The Luftwaffe that Wever was helping to build did not share his strategic priorities with the unanimity that his position might have suggested. Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe's commander, supported Wever's programs without fully grasping the strategic concepts that motivated them. Ernst Udet, the legendary fighter ace whose technical responsibilities were expanding, favored dive bombers whose tactical precision appealed to his pilot's instincts more than heavy bombers whose strategic employment seemed abstract. The younger officers who were shaping Luftwaffe doctrine emphasized close support for ground forces, the integration of air power with armored operations that would become the blitzkrieg that conquered Europe. Wever's vision of independent strategic bombing existed alongside these tactical priorities without having achieved the institutional dominance that implementation would require. The aircraft on the drafting table represented programs whose continuation depended on advocacy that only Wever could provide. The Dornier Do-19 and Junkers UA-89 were expensive, consumed resources that tactical aircraft could otherwise employ, required production capacity that dive bombers and medium bombers would also need. The arguments against them were practical and immediate. The arguments for them were strategic and contingent on assumptions about future wars whose validity could not be demonstrated until wars occurred. Wever made these arguments in meetings and memoranda, in conversations whose content his position enabled and whose outcomes his advocacy influenced. The four-engine bomber program survived because he insisted that it survive, because his authority within the Luftwaffe hierarchy
could sustain priorities that institutional skepticism would otherwise have terminated. The spring sunlight that entered through the ministry windows illuminated blueprints whose fate was approaching a turning point that no one in the room could foresee. Wever had 5 weeks to live. The aircraft he was examining would never enter production. The strategic capability he was attempting to build would never exist. The Luftwaffe that would fight the Second World War would lack the heavy bombers that his vision had prescribed, and that his death would prevent Germany from acquiring. The decision that was about to be unmade not by deliberate policy reversal, but by the accident that would remove the single officer whose advocacy sustained it, would shape the air war in ways that victories and defeats would later reveal but could not undo.
The strategic vision that Wever embodied had been developing since his earliest days with the nascent Luftwaffe, shaped by study and reflection that his infantry background might have seemed unlikely to produce. He had read Duhay's The Command of the Air with the attention that serious officers devoted to works claiming to have identified warfare's future, had absorbed the Italian theorists' arguments that bomber fleets striking at enemy cities and industries could achieve decision without the grinding attrition that the Western Front had imposed. He had studied Mitchell's advocacy for independent air forces capable of strategic operations beyond the battlefield, had followed the debates in Britain, where Trenchard's Royal Air Force was developing doctrine that emphasized bombing as air power's decisive contribution. The synthesis that emerged from this study was distinctively Wever's own, less apocalyptic than Duhay, more focused on industrial targets than civilian morale, grounded in the practical requirements that German strategic circumstances would impose. The geography of potential conflict shaped Wever's thinking with particular force. Germany occupied Central Europe, surrounded by nations whose industrial capacities would determine their military potential in any extended war. The Soviet Union possessed factories beyond the Ural Mountains, whose distance from any European frontier would protect them from ground assault, regardless of how successfully German armies might advance. Britain's industrial heartland lay across the Channel and the North Sea, reachable by aircraft, but not by naval armies that would first need to achieve naval superiority that Germany had failed to establish in the previous war. France's industries were closer, but still required aircraft capable of sustained operations at ranges that tactical bombers could not achieve while carrying meaningful payloads. The conclusion that geography imposed was that Germany required long-range heavy bombers or would lack the means to strike at the productive foundations of any major enemy. The specifications that Wever approved for the Ural-Bomber program reflected these geographic imperatives translated into engineering requirements. The aircraft would need to reach targets 1,500 kilometers from German bases while carrying bomb loads sufficient to inflict meaningful damage, perhaps 2,000 kilograms, enough to destroy factory buildings or transportation choke points. They would need defensive armament adequate to survive interception by enemy fighters operating over their home territory. They would need the reliability that long overwater flights or deep penetrations into hostile airspace demanded, the ability to return from missions whose duration would stress engines and crews beyond anything tactical operations required. The requirements were demanding, but not impossible. The technology existed, the engineering challenges were manageable. The production capacity could be developed if leadership committed resources that commitment would require. Wever's advocacy extended beyond technical specifications to doctrinal development that would govern how strategic bombers would be employed. He established a strategic bombing study group within the Luftwaffe staff, tasked officers with analyzing target systems whose destruction would produce maximum effect on enemy war-making capacity, developed plans for campaigns that would systematically dismantle the industrial foundations of potential adversaries. The work was preliminary, constrained by the limited intelligence available about Soviet or British industrial organization, shaped by assumptions that actual operations would test and revise. But the work was proceeding, was establishing the institutional foundation that operational employment would require.
was preparing the Luftwaffe to conduct strategic bombing if strategic bombers became available. The resistance that Wever encountered reflected priorities that would dominate the Luftwaffe after his death, but that his presence could still contain. The dive bomber advocates, led increasingly by Ernst Udet, argued that precision attack against tactical targets, bridges, headquarters, troop concentrations, would prove more effective than strategic bombing, whose accuracy could not be guaranteed and whose effects could not be immediately observed. The medium bomber proponents contended that aircraft like the HE-111 and DO-107 could reach most relevant targets while requiring less production capacity and crew training than four-engine heavies. The Army cooperation enthusiasts emphasized that the Luftwaffe's primary mission was supporting ground forces, that resources devoted to strategic bombing would be diverted from the close air support that blitzkrieg operations would require. Wever answered these objections with arguments that his authority made persuasive and that his absence would leave unanswered. Strategic bombing and tactical aviation were complementary rather than competing. A balanced air force required both capabilities, the emphasis shifting according to operational circumstances that could not be predicted in peacetime. The medium bombers that critics preferred lacked the range and payload to strike at targets whose destruction would produce strategic effect. They were useful aircraft, but not substitutes for heavy bombers whose capabilities they could not replicate. The Ural-Bomber program was not diverting resources from other priorities, but was developing capabilities that no other program could provide. The arguments prevailed while Wever lived. They would not survive his death. The crash occurred on the morning of June 3, 1936, at Dresden-Cloché airfield, under circumstances that would later seem unbearably mundane given the consequences they produced. Wever had been attending a memorial service in Dresden and was returning to Berlin by air, his schedule compressed by the demands that his position imposed, and his preference for aviation over ground travel, reflecting the commitment to air power that defined his professional identity. The aircraft was a Heinkel HE-70 Blitz, a fast courier plane whose sleek lines and modern design embodied the technological progress that the new Luftwaffe represented. The morning was clear, the conditions suitable for flight, the routine nature of the journey suggesting nothing of what was about to occur. The HE-70 began its takeoff roll at approximately 0900 hours, accelerating along the runway, with the engine note rising as speed increased toward the velocity that flight required. Witnesses observed the aircraft lift from the ground, climb briefly, then bank sharply before diving into the airfield, with an impact that killed Wever and his flight engineer instantly. The investigation that followed determined that the aileron gust locks, devices that secured the control surfaces when the aircraft was parked to prevent wind damage, had not been removed before takeoff. The oversight was elementary, the kind of pre-flight check that any competent pilot would perform, and that Wever, in the haste of his departure, had apparently neglected or delegated without verification. The Chief of Staff of the Luftwaffe had been killed by a procedural failure that student pilots were trained to avoid. The smell of aviation fuel and burned wreckage hung over the crash site as emergency crews approached debris that contained nothing they could save. The impact had been catastrophic, the aircraft's speed at contact transforming its structure into fragments scattered across an area that the violence of deceleration had defined. Wever's body was recovered from wreckage whose configuration revealed the nature of the failure, control surfaces locked in position, the aircraft unresponsive to inputs that a functioning system would have translated into flight corrections. The Luftwaffe's first chief of staff had been killed not by enemy action or equipment failure, but by a procedural item overlooked in the routine preparations for a routine flight. The funeral that followed brought the Luftwaffe's leadership to Dresden, their presence acknowledging the magnitude of what had been lost and the uncertainty that loss had created. Goering delivered the eulogy, his words praising Wever's contributions without fully grasping the strategic vision that those contributions had embodied. The officers who assembled around the grave included advocates and skeptics of Wever's programs, their temporary unity in mourning concealing the conflicts that his death would now resolve in favor of those who had opposed him. The four-engine bomber program that Wever had sustained through years of advocacy was about to lose the protection that his authority had provided. The decisions came quickly once the immediate mourning had concluded. Albert Kesselring succeeded Wever as Chief of Staff, bringing different priorities and different assessments of what the Luftwaffe required. The DO-19 and Ju-89 programs were reviewed by officers whose enthusiasm for strategic bombing had always been limited and whose objections Wever's presence had contained. The aircraft were judged too slow, too expensive, too demanding of production resources that tactical aircraft could more efficiently employ. The prototypes that had been built would complete their test programs, but no production orders would follow. The Ural-Bomber was dead, killed not by the crash at Dresden, but by the removal of the single officer whose advocacy had kept it alive. The Luftwaffe that emerged from these decisions would be configured for tactical operations whose brilliance would conquer Europe and whose limitations would become apparent only when conquest failed to produce surrender. The dive bombers that Udeck championed, the medium bombers that Doctrine preferred, the fighter aircraft that would achieve temporary superiority over every battlefield, these would constitute the air force that Germany built, while the heavy bomber capability that Wever had prescribed remained undeveloped. The decision was not irrational given the assumptions that guided it, not obviously wrong in the context of the short wars that German planning anticipated. But the assumptions would prove mistaken. The context would expand beyond anything short wars could address, and the absence of strategic bombing capability would constrain German options in ways that those who canceled the program could not foresee and would not live to fully comprehend. The grave at Dresden received the remains of a vision as well as a man, the strategic conception that might have given Germany the instrument to strike at enemies whose industrial heartlands lay beyond the reach of medium bombers and dive bombers and fighter aircraft, optimized for tactical battles that institutional preference had prioritized. Wever had understood what the Luftwaffe would need. He had not survived to ensure that understanding translated into capability. The consequences of Wever's death and the decisions that followed became apparent to Edgar Peterson in the summer of 1940 as he watched the Luftwaffe consume itself in operations that strategic bombers might have made unnecessary. Peterson was 36 years old, a former commercial pilot from Hamburg who had flown passenger routes across Europe before the war transformed civil aviation into a reservoir of trained air crews that military expansion would drain. His face bore the weathered features of a man who had spent years in open cockpits before enclosed cabins became standard, his hands calloused from controls whose responsiveness he had learned to read through sensations that instrumentation could not replace. The Battle of Britain that was unfolding beneath the aircraft he commanded was teaching lessons about air power that pre-war decisions had made impossible to apply. The Heinkel 111 medium bombers that Peterson's unit operated against British targets carried bomb loads of approximately 2,000 kilograms, respectable by tactical standards, inadequate for the strategic mission that circumstances were now demanding. The aircraft could reach targets throughout southern England, could penetrate to London and the Midland cities whose factories produced the weapons that British resistance required, but the penetration came at costs that medium bomber design could not mitigate. The aircraft's defensive armament insufficient against fighters whose interception the range and duration of missions made inevitable. The losses accumulated through August and September at rates that replacement could not sustain. Crews dying in aircraft that could reach their targets but could not survive the reaching. The smell of aviation fuel and the particular tension of briefing rooms became the sensory environment within which Peterson's understanding of the Luftwaffe's limitations progressively developed. The missions his crews flew were demanding what medium bombers could not provide: the payload capacity to inflict decisive damage on industrial targets, the defensive armament to survive deep penetrations, the range to reach facilities that British dispersal was progressively relocating beyond convenient distance. The aircraft that Weaver's program would have produced, four-engine heavies with the range to reach any target in Britain, the payload to devastate factory complexes, the defensive firepower to contest interception, did not exist because decisions made 4 years earlier had ensured they would not exist. The British response to German bombing illustrated what the Luftwaffe lacked by demonstrating what strategic bombing required. The Royal Air Force's Bomber Command was already developing the heavy bomber force that would devastate German cities in subsequent years: the Stirlings and Halifaxes and Lancasters, whose four engines would carry payloads that German medium bombers could not approach. The British had made different decisions in the 1930s, had invested in strategic bomber capability despite costs that tactical alternatives would have reduced, had built the aircraft that Wever had advocated and that his death had prevented Germany from building. The asymmetry that would define the air war was already taking shape, visible to officers like Peterson, who understood what they were seeing and could not change what understanding revealed. The tactical situation that summer exposed the strategic gap with clarity that no peacetime analysis could have provided. British aircraft factories were producing fighters faster than German attacks could destroy them. The Hurricane and Spitfire production dispersed across facilities that medium bomber payloads could damage but not eliminate. The synthetic fuel plants and ball bearing factories, whose destruction might have crippled British war production, lay beyond effective reach, not geographically beyond range, but operationally beyond the capability that available aircraft could deliver. The Luftwaffe was attacking Britain with instruments designed for different purposes, attempting strategic effect with tactical weapons whose inadequacy each mission demonstrated. Peterson watched his squadron's strength decline through the summer as the attrition that medium bomber vulnerability imposed accumulated into losses that training could not replace. The crews who died over England were experienced pilots and navigators and bombardiers whose skills had been developed through years of preparation that compressed wartime training could not replicate. Each aircraft lost represented not merely production capacity consumed, but institutional knowledge eliminated. The human capital that effective bombing operations required progressively degraded by missions whose costs exceeded their effects. The Luftwaffe was bleeding itself against an enemy whose industrial foundations it could reach but could not destroy, whose production capacity it could inconvenience but could not eliminate. The strategic implications of what Peterson observed extended beyond the immediate campaign to the war's fundamental trajectory. Germany had attacked Britain expecting that air assault would compel accommodation, that the destruction bombing could inflict would produce the political capitulation that ground invasion might not achieve. The expectation assumed capabilities that the Luftwaffe did not possess, assumed that the aircraft available could deliver the effects that strategic bombing theory predicted. The assumption was wrong because the aircraft that could have made it right had been canceled 4 years earlier, had died with the officer whose advocacy had sustained them, had been sacrificed to priorities whose validity the summer of 1940 was systematically disproven. The Heinkel He-177 Greif represented Germany's belated attempt to acquire the strategic capability that Wever's death had foreclosed, and Peterson's experience with the aircraft would demonstrate why belated attempts could not compensate for decisions whose consequences had already accumulated. The He-177 program began in 1936, the same year Wever died, its specifications calling for a heavy bomber capable of the long-range missions that the canceled Ural-Bomber program had envisioned. The aircraft that eventually emerged from this program would become one of the Luftwaffe's most notorious failures, a machine whose design compromises and engineering defects would kill more German air crews than enemy action, and whose operational record would confirm that strategic bombing capability could not be improvised once the foundational decisions had been made. The fundamental flaw that doomed the He-177 originated in requirements that reflected the Luftwaffe's institutional confusion about what heavy bombers were supposed to accomplish. Ernst Udet, whose authority over technical development expanded after Wever's death, insisted that the aircraft be capable of dive bombing, a requirement that made sense for tactical aircraft, but that imposed constraints on heavy bomber design whose consequences engineering could not overcome. The structural stresses that diving imposed required airframe reinforcement that added weight, which demanded more powerful engines, which created cooling problems that the He-177's configuration could not solve. The aircraft's designers attempted to meet the diving requirement while maintaining the range and payload that strategic missions demanded, and the compromises they accepted would prove fatal. The engine arrangement that the He-177 employed was the source of its most catastrophic problems. Rather than mounting 4 separate engines in conventional nacelles, the design coupled pairs of engines to drive single propellers through complex gearboxes whose mechanical demands exceeded what German engineering could reliably produce. The DB606 and later DB610 coupled engines generated adequate power, but also generated heat that accumulated in the cells whose ventilation was inadequate for the thermal loads that coupled operation produced. The engines caught fire with regularity that crews learned to expect and that modifications could not eliminate, the aircraft earning the nickname Luftwaffen-Feuerzeug, the Luftwaffe's lighter, from men whose survival depended on machines they could not trust. Peterson encountered the He-177 in 1942 when his responsibilities expanded to include experimental operations that the Luftwaffe's conventional units could not perform. The aircraft that he was expected to employ for long-range missions represented the strategic bomber that Germany had belatedly attempted to build, the capability that Wever had advocated and that 4 years of alternative priorities had delayed, until delay itself had become a form of denial. The He-177 could carry significant bomb loads to ranges that medium bombers could not approach, could theoretically strike at targets whose distance had protected them from earlier attacks. Theoretically, because the aircraft's reliability problems meant that reaching targets was never assured, and returning from them was a matter of fortune that skill could not guarantee. The smell of hydraulic fluid and the particular anxiety of pre-flight inspections became defining features of operations involving the He-177. Crews examined their aircraft with attention that reflected knowledge of what examination might miss and what missing might cause. The engine nacelles that housed the coupled power plants were checked for fuel leaks whose presence the heat of operation would transform into conflagration. The hydraulic lines that controlled flight surfaces were inspected for the failures that combat damage could produce, but that manufacturing defects produced equally well. The aircraft that taxied toward runways for takeoff were machines whose capacity to complete missions depended on mechanical factors that no amount of crew proficiency could control. The operational record that accumulated confirmed what individual experiences suggested. The He-177 units that formed in 1942 and 1943 lost aircraft to non-combat causes at rates that would have been scandalous for any other type, and that for the He-177 were simply expected. Engines failed during takeoff, their fires consuming aircraft before crews could escape. Wings separated during maneuvers that stress had compromised before combat imposed its additional demands. Aircraft disappeared on missions from which no distress calls were received, their fates unknown, but their causes easily imagined. The strategic bomber that Germany had finally built was a strategic bomber that Germany could not operationally employ, its capabilities theoretical, its defects practical and lethal.
Peterson managed operations involving the H-177 with the professional detachment that managing the unmanageable required and that concealing frustration demanded. The aircraft could accomplish missions when it functioned, could reach targets that medium bombers could not approach, could deliver payloads that tactical aircraft could not carry. The occasions when it functioned were occasions that planning could not predict, that operational requirements could not command, that the gap between capability and reliability made essentially random. The strategic bomber force that Wever had envisioned would have entered service years earlier, would have benefited from development time that reliability required, would have been operational when strategic bombing could have influenced outcomes that its absence was determining. The H-177 arrived too late, too flawed, too compromised by the decisions that had delayed it, to provide what earlier decisions had denied. The consequences of Germany's missing strategic bomber capability became fully apparent by 1943, when Peterson observed Allied heavy bombers devastating German industry, while Germany possessed nothing capable of equivalent response. The asymmetry that Wever's death had initiated had matured into strategic reality, whose implications extended across every aspect of the air war. American B-17s and B-24s were joining British Lancasters and Halifaxes in raids whose weight Germany could not match, whose targets Germany could not protect, whose cumulative effect Germany could not survive. The decision made in 1936 was producing consequences in 1943 that no decision made in 1943 could reverse. The missions that Peterson's units flew during this period represented improvisation attempting to achieve what proper capability would have provided. His Kampfgeschwader 200 conducted special operations that the Luftwaffe's conventional structure could not perform: agent insertions, supply drops to isolated garrisons, reconnaissance of targets beyond normal operational range. The missions required aircraft pushed beyond their designed purposes, crews trained for operations that standard doctrine did not address, planning that created solutions for problems that adequate equipment would have prevented. The improvisation was sometimes successful, sometimes catastrophic, always a reminder that improvisation was necessary only because proper preparation had been foreclosed. The bombing of German cities that intensified through 1943 and 1944 demonstrated what strategic air power could accomplish when properly developed and adequately equipped. Hamburg burned in July 1943, the firestorm that Allied incendiary attacks created, killing approximately 37,000 civilians in a single night. The industrial facilities that ringed the city, the shipyards, the petroleum refineries, the U-boat construction halls, were damaged or destroyed in raids whose scale German defenses could contest but not defeat. Peterson observed the aftermath through reconnaissance photographs, whose images revealed destruction that medium bombers could never have inflicted, and that German medium bombers could never inflict in return. The asymmetry was becoming massacre. The Soviet industrial centers that Wever's Ural-Bomber had been designed to reach remained untouched throughout the war, their factories producing the tanks and aircraft that were grinding German forces to destruction on the Eastern Front. The relocation of Soviet industry beyond the Urals in 1941 and 1942 had moved production facilities to distances that German aircraft could not reach,
had placed the foundries and assembly plants that sustained Soviet military power beyond any possibility of interdiction. The bombers that Wever had advocated would have been capable of reaching these targets, of striking at the industrial foundation that Soviet resistance required, of imposing costs on production that geography otherwise protected. The bombers did not exist. The targets remained untouched. The factories produced. The British industrial heartland that lay across the North Sea similarly remained beyond effective German reach after the medium bomber force had exhausted itself in 1940 and 1941. The Midlands factories that produced Spitfires and Hurricanes, the engine plants that powered British aircraft and vehicles, the steel mills and ammunition works that sustained British war economy, these facilities continued operating throughout the war, their production unimpeded by German attacks whose weight could not achieve strategic effect. The H-177 might theoretically have reached these targets if the H-177 had been reliable, if production had been adequate, if the years lost to the canceled four-engine program had not created gaps that belated efforts could not close. The theories remained theories. The targets remained productive.
Peterson's understanding of what Germany lacked deepened as he coordinated with units attempting operations that proper capability would have made routine. Long-range reconnaissance missions that four-engine aircraft could have performed safely required medium bombers operating at the edge of their range, their survival dependent on fortune that planning could not guarantee. Maritime patrol operations that strategic aircraft could have sustained required improvised solutions whose inadequacy German naval commanders repeatedly criticized. The strike missions against distant targets that strategic bombers could have executed remained beyond German capability, their objectives visible on maps that marked possibilities rather than plans. The counterfactual haunted planning sessions whose participants understood what they lacked and could not acquire. If Germany had possessed four-engine bombers in 1940, the Battle of Britain might have proceeded differently. Heavier payloads delivered with greater accuracy against industrial targets whose destruction might have accomplished what medium bomber attrition could not. If Germany had possessed strategic bombers in 1941, the Soviet industrial evacuation might have been contested. Factories in transit might have been destroyed, relocation disrupted, the production that would sustain Soviet resistance in subsequent years eliminated before relocation could protect it. If Germany had possessed the aircraft that Wever had advocated, the war might have been different in ways that absence was making impossible to achieve. The men who had canceled the four-engine bomber program were not available to explain their decisions to those who were experiencing the consequences. Udet had committed suicide in 1941, his death officially attributed to accident, but actually reflecting despair at failures whose weight included the technical decisions that had compromised German aircraft development. The institutional momentum that had favored tactical aviation over strategic bombing had dissipated as strategic bombing's absence became strategically decisive. The Luftwaffe that was losing the air war in 1943 was losing it in exactly the aircraft that decisions made in 1936 had ensured it would possess. Aircraft adequate for purposes that the war had transcended, inadequate for challenges that the war had imposed. The counterfactual that haunted German planners acquired sharper contours as the war progressed, and the consequences of the missing bomber force became impossible to ignore. Peterson participated in discussions whose participants understood what might have been different and what could no longer be changed, the strategic alternatives that adequate air power would have provided and that inadequate air power had foreclosed. The conversations occurred in headquarters whose maps displayed fronts contracting under pressure that air superiority had enabled, in briefing rooms where operational limitations were acknowledged with the bitter clarity that operational experience provided. The war that Germany was losing was being lost in part
because decisions made in 1936 had denied Germany instruments that 1943 desperately required. The scenario that recurred in these discussions was straightforward in its strategic logic. Had Germany possessed four-engine bombers in 1940, the attacks on British industry could have achieved effects that medium bomber raids had failed to produce. The aircraft factories whose output had won the Battle of Britain could have been destroyed by payloads that medium bombers could not deliver, their dispersal complicated by raids whose weight demanded concentration of defenses that dispersal would have weakened. The Luftwaffe's losses during the battle had resulted largely from the medium bomber's vulnerability, inadequate defensive armament, insufficient speed, inability to absorb damage that combat inevitably inflicted. Heavy bombers with multiple gun positions, with airframes robust enough to sustain hits that medium bombers could not survive, might have maintained the pressure that attrition had forced Germany to abandon. The Eastern Front scenario was equally compelling in its implications. The Soviet industrial evacuation of 1941 and 1942 had moved approximately 1,500 factories from threatened Western regions to locations beyond the Urals, a logistical achievement whose success had enabled Soviet military production to continue and eventually exceed German capacity. The evacuation had required months, had utilized rail networks whose vulnerability to air attack was profound, had concentrated industrial assets in transit in ways that tactical bombers could not reach, but that strategic bombers would have found ideal. The factories that German ground forces had been unable to capture might have been destroyed by aircraft that could reach them during the vulnerable period of relocation. The production that sustained Soviet resistance through 1942 and beyond might have been eliminated before it could be established in its new locations. Peterson understood these scenarios without being able to alter the reality they contradicted. The bombers that would have enabled different outcomes did not exist because decisions had ensured they would not exist, because the officer who had advocated them had died before his advocacy could achieve irreversible institutional commitment, because the alternatives that seemed adequate in 1936 had proven catastrophically inadequate by 1943. The scenarios were not fantasies, they were analyses of possibilities that actual decisions had foreclosed, assessments of what might have been that illuminated why what was could not be changed.
The contrast with Allied capabilities made the German deficiency more painful to contemplate. The British and Americans had invested in strategic bomber forces despite costs that tactical alternatives would have reduced, had accepted the production burdens that four-engine aircraft imposed, had developed the doctrine and infrastructure that strategic bombing required. Their investment was now paying returns whose scale Germany could observe but not match. German cities burning, German factories demolished, German transportation networks interdicted by aircraft that Germany could not prevent from reaching their targets and could not replicate in striking back. The Allies had made different decisions in the 1930s and were reaping consequences in the 1940s that validated those decisions with devastating finality. The irony that Wever's vision was correct intensified as evidence accumulated confirming every element of his strategic analysis. Industrial targeting produced strategic effects that tactical operations could not replicate, exactly as he had argued. Long-range aircraft capable of reaching enemy heartlands provided options that shorter-range systems could not approach, exactly as he had insisted. The balanced air force that combined tactical and strategic capabilities proved superior to forces optimized exclusively for battlefield support, exactly as he had advocated. The Luftwaffe had ignored Wever's vision, had canceled his programs, had built the air force that his opponents preferred. The air force they had built was losing the war that his vision might have won differently. The officers who discussed these alternatives understood that discussion could change nothing, that the decisions whose consequences they were experiencing had been made years earlier by men who could not have fully foreseen what they were deciding. The crash at Dresden in 1936 had killed more than an officer. It had killed a conception of air power whose absence was now determining outcomes that its presence might have altered. Wever had been right. Being right had not saved him, had not saved his programs, had not saved Germany from consequences that his vision might have prevented and that his death had guaranteed. The counterfactual haunted those who contemplated it, because the counterfactual revealed what had been lost and what losing it had cost. Peterson returned from these discussions to operations that the discussions had illuminated, to missions that improvisation attempted and adequate capability would have made routine. The war continued with the aircraft that decisions had provided, the medium bombers and dive bombers and fighters that tactical priorities had produced. The war was being lost with these aircraft because these aircraft could not accomplish what winning required, could not reach what needed reaching, could not destroy what needed destroying. The decision that seemed reasonable in 1936 was proving catastrophic in 1943, and nothing that 1943 could do would change what 1936 had determined. The war's final years carried Peterson through operations whose futility the strategic situation had determined, and whose execution his professional obligations nonetheless required. Kampfgeschwader 200 conducted missions that ranged from the desperate to the bizarre, long-range reconnaissance flights over Soviet territory that strategic bombers would have performed routinely, agent drops behind Allied lines that proper capability would have made more effective, experimental operations testing weapons whose development had come too late to affect outcomes that earlier development might have influenced. The unit became a repository for the Luftwaffe's improvisations, the missions that conventional formations could not perform and that adequate strategic capability would have made unnecessary. The He 177 that represented Germany's belated strategic bomber continued killing its crews through mechanical failure at rates that enemy action would have struggled to match. The aircraft that Peterson's units operated when missions demanded range and payload that medium bombers could not provide remained unreliable in ways that modifications could not correct and that fundamental redesign would have required time to implement. The crews who flew these machines accepted risks that operational necessity imposed and that adequate pre-war development would have eliminated. Their deaths attributable not to enemy skill, but to engineering compromises whose origins traced to decisions made years before the war began. The Allied bombing that intensified through 1944 and into 1945 demonstrated with increasing clarity what strategic air power could accomplish when properly developed. German synthetic fuel production collapsed under attacks that Germany could not prevent and could not answer in kind. German transportation networks disintegrated as Allied bombers interdicted rail lines and marshalling yards that German movement required and German defenses could not protect. German cities burned in raids whose weight Germany had no means to replicate against enemies whose homelands remained beyond effective German reach. The asymmetry that Wever's death had initiated achieved its fullest expression in the war's final months. German industry destroyed by aircraft that Germany did not build and could not counter.
Peterson survived the war's end in circumstances that the chaos of defeat made arbitrary and that survival itself made fortunate. The units he had commanded dissolved as organized resistance collapsed, their personnel scattering into the confusion that occupation imposed and that individual fates would resolve according to patterns that no planning could anticipate. He was captured by Allied forces
whose interest in German aviation experience extended beyond the immediate purposes that captivity served. His knowledge of Luftwaffe operations, valuable to intelligence officers assessing what Germany had accomplished and what Germany had failed to accomplish. The post-war years provided opportunities for reflection that wartime had precluded and that survival had made possible. Peterson contributed to historical understanding of Luftwaffe operations through interviews and documentation whose purposes included ensuring that the decisions whose consequences he had experienced would be understood by those whose interest in understanding might prevent repetition. The absence of strategic bombing capability that had constrained German operations throughout the war became a subject of analysis whose conclusions confirmed what operational experience had demonstrated, that the decision to cancel the four-engine bomber program had been among the most consequential decisions of the pre-war period, its effects extending across every theater and every phase of the air war. He lived to see German aviation reconstituted within the framework of Western alliance, the Bundesluftwaffe that emerged in the 1950s, equipped with aircraft that Allied production had developed and that German participation in NATO made available. The strategic bombing capability that Wever had advocated and that Wever's death had denied became available to Germany through alliance rather than indigenous development. The heavy bombers that might have changed the war's course now operated by allies whose victory had made German participation in their structures possible. The irony was not lost on officers whose careers had been shaped by the absence of capabilities that alliance now provided. Peterson died on March 9, 1986, in Hamburg, Germany, the city of his birth, at the age of 81. His contributions to aviation history included documentation of operations whose limitations he had experienced firsthand and whose origins in pre-war decisions he had come to understand with the clarity that hindsight and survival provided. The war that had consumed his professional years and shaped his professional understanding had ended 4 decades earlier, its lessons preserved in archives that scholars consulted and in memories that survivors carried until survival itself concluded. Wever had been dead for 50 years by the time Peterson joined him, the crash at Dresden having removed from the Luftwaffe's leadership the single officer whose vision and authority might have ensured that Germany possessed strategic bombing capability when strategic bombing could have mattered. The grave at Dresden contained remains that represented more than an individual's mortality. It contained the death of a conception of air power whose absence had shaped the war in ways that presence might have altered. The four-engine bombers that Wever had championed were never built. The targets they might have struck remained productive throughout the war. The enemies they might have damaged emerged victorious from a conflict whose air component had been determined in part by a checklist item overlooked on a June morning in 1936. The decision that changed the air war was not a decision in the sense of deliberate choice among recognized alternatives. It was an accident whose consequences included the reversal of decisions that the accident's victim had sustained, the cancellation of programs that his advocacy had protected, the construction of an air force optimized for purposes that the war would transcend. Wever had understood what Germany needed. His understanding died with him. The Luftwaffe built what his successors preferred. What they preferred could not accomplish what the war required. The air war that resulted was shaped by absence as much as presence, by capability that did not exist as much as capability that did, by the four-engine bombers that Germany never built and that Germany's enemies built in numbers that Germany could not match and could not survive. The lesson that this history might teach, that strategic decisions made in peacetime determine outcomes that wartime cannot alter, that capabilities foreclosed cannot be improvised, that visions abandoned leave voids that desperation cannot fill, remained available for those whose attention to the past might inform choices whose consequences would extend into futures they could not foresee. Whether attention would be paid was uncertain. What was certain was that inattention had costs, that decisions had consequences, that the crash at Dresden had changed more than the life it ended. It had changed the war. It had changed history. It had demonstrated that sometimes the most consequential decisions are the ones that are never made because the men who would have made them do not survive to make them.